We have a really exciting program this morning, but before that, we have a Watershed Council ceremony that we need to perform. And borrowing again from Robin Kimmerer's book, quote, ceremony focuses attention so that attention becomes intention. If you stand together and profess a thing before your community, it holds you accountable. On that note, I now call the 2023 annual meeting of Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council to order. And we begin with review and approval of last year's minutes, which were circulated in your packet. And I'd be happy to entertain a motion to approve those minutes or amend them as needed. There's a motion for approval. Is there a second? Second. There's a second. Discussion? All in favor of approving last year's minutes, say aye. Aye. Opposed? The annual meeting minutes are approved. I want to take a minute now. Our next main task is to elect a slate of new board members for the upcoming cycle. I want to just take a minute and talk about how one gets on the board. Our terms are 3 years in length. Board members are limited to 2 successive terms. So we like to recruit people who are at least think they'll be available for a 6-year period of time. Nominations are prepared. A slate is prepared by a committee of the board, the governance committee, based on staff recommendations and nominations from the lake associations that make up a big part of our membership. We can also appoint members in between election cycles. If vacancies occur on the board, we can also appoint people to those places on a board vote, and we've done that a couple of times this year, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, what I'd like to do is to identify the candidates that our nominating committee is put forth to fill the empty places on the board at the present time. First is Scott Davis, and if you could just stand up when I call your name. Scott's from the Douglas Lake Association. Brian Hayes. Brian is from the Three Lakes Association. Mike Hayes. Mike's the Walloon Lake Association. Anna Schwab is Sheboygan County at large. Greg Waltz, Emmett County at large. So these are your candidates for our board positions, and I would entertain a motion to elect them as a slate. Is there a second? Second. Moved and seconded that the nominations be accepted. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. You guys can sit down life being what it is, I've had really solid conversations with just about every one of these folks, and I've met several of them for the first time this morning. So looking for name tags to put with familiar phone call conversations. All right, at this point, I'd like to also recognize our outgoing board members. Let's see, I'm not sure. Anyway, we have, these are people that have served full terms and are leaving the board. One is Bill Foster. I don't think Bill is here this morning. Jim Muth, Donna Stein, and the really solid rock of the group, Dennis Rudy. and Chuck Canese, who will be our new vice president, made arrangements with these plaques and presents the award. Get the one with the right name on it. All right, thank you. I'd also like to introduce new board members who were appointed earlier this year to fill positions that were created by resignations on the board. Bob Kingan of the Elk Skegamog Lakes Association, and Linda Adams, who will be at large from Emmett County. And I'm going to just read off the names of the people who are continuing on the board, most of whom are here today. Donna Perla, Perry Irish Hodson, Jerry Huey, Mary Beth Kazansky, Chuck Canese, Carrie Slavic, Mike Supernaw, Amanda Wienert, and myself. And that's your board team for the upcoming year. We're looking forward to having a really productive time. It is going to be a challenging time for this particular board. This last year has not been a business as usual year for Tip of the Mitt. The way I phrase it, we are experiencing an unplanned and sudden leadership transition. Within the context of one of the most challenging times for any nonprofit, which is hiring a new executive director to replace a founding charismatic leader. In our case, it was complicated by COVID, and trying to do that during COVID, it has not gone well. We had an executive director who was with us for a very short period of time, and it's been a rocky period. The results will be seen in the financial statement that Dennis is going to go through with us in a few minutes. Can be seen in the faces of our staff, many of whom are new to the organization, and there's also the absence of some old familiar faces. There's plenty of good news as well. We remain financially sound with adequate cash to maintain the mission work while we reorganize. We have put in place an interim management arrangement led by Kim Baker, who you'll meet in a few minutes. Kim has been a godsend. He is an ordained Episcopal minister, and I mean that almost literally. We were successful in recruiting several new staff members who are well qualified and enthusiastic about our work. Tomorrow I will charge a five-person search team with the task of recruiting a new executive director for the organization. That work will begin immediately. We have tremendous goodwill within our service area. I made a lot of phone calls and trying to recruit people and reorganize things after things came apart at the end of March. Not everybody was able to serve, but everybody I spoke with had very good things to say about TIP, and just the depth of enthusiasm you could feel this morning when I asked you to greet each other. So that's the good news, and we're really working our way towards the program, which is why most of us are here this morning. I do want to we're going to cover a couple of little things in terms of what's going on. Dennis Rudy is going to update us on the financials, and then he'll introduce Kim Baker, who will give you an overview from his perspective. And then we'll take a bit of a break after that. Dennis?
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to keep comments pretty brief. You've got a snapshot here that kind of shows you our revenue and expenses. Really, the key takeaways I think out of this chart here would be that our, I don't know if you can see it, but our contributions make up 40% of our income. Those contributions come from you and hundreds of other folks who couldn't make it this morning. Can't do our mission without all of the help that you provide. Another big chunk of our revenue comes from grants. So grants are kind of an interesting thing. It took me a while to figure out grants. But grants take many different forms. They can be 6-month grants to paint a mural on the side of a building. It could be a 3-year project that takes years to complete, requires lots of different subcontractors and so on. So we get grants from a lot of different organizations, and again, some of them are quick and dirty, some of them last a long time, so they carry over year to year. But those are the two main sources of our revenue. And you can see contracts, our investments provide some income to us as well. If we move to the expense side, what we've done here is really try to take all of the dollars that we spend and lump them into our key areas, so you can get a feel for how much of our money is spent towards water protection, which is clearly the biggest one. Policy, advocacy, our education, Watershed Academy programs, and then some of the things we need to do just to keep the doors open, the overhead management and so on. So those are the main categories of expenses. You might have noticed it, you might not have noticed it, but in 2022 we actually had a deficit. Our expenses out were higher than our revenues. That does happen time to time. What we do is in those situations we draw on our savings that have been developed over the years, again, mainly through the support of membership. So the money that we get, we manage very carefully, we invest it wisely, and we save for a rainy day. 2022 was a bit of a rainy day. I am very pleased to say, though, that our savings are solid. We have a good, strong financial footing going forward. So the fact that we had to dig into savings a little bit for 2022 does not impact our ability to carry forward, move forward with our results, with our mission going forward. So with that, unless anybody has any questions, I guess we do.
How much is the backup fund?
How much is the backup fund?
Yeah.
We've got just under $3 million of unrestricted funding.
Is the deficit caused by an increase in expenses or a reduction in revenue? Or a combination?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors, I would say, and without trying to make it a really long answer, think back to what I mentioned about grants. Some of these grants are short, some of them are very long term. What happened in 2021? We had this thing called COVID. We didn't meet as a group face to face, it was all Zoom. Think about how that impacts the development of grants. And if some of them are carryovers, we found 2022 to be a low revenue side on the grant part of our balance sheet. So that was probably the biggest impact. As Tom mentioned, we did have quite a few transitions with employees. We brought in new people, took some time to do that, spent some money to do that. So there were certain expenses that were a little bit higher than we expected. But the short answer is the biggest impact for 2022 would have been lower grant revenue, primarily because of carryover from
Do you have any figures on membership? How many members we have?
We do. We have a membership report. Unfortunately, Kenyon, I did not bring that with me. I don't have a number in mind right now. Maybe somebody from the staff could pull that up or something.
No, I don't have it on top of mind, but Kenny and I can send it over to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do know just in that, along those lines, Kenyon, I know that what we have seen thus far this year, and by the way, most of our contributions come in at the end of the year. So at this time of the year, we're always looking at, okay, hope everybody writes a check at the end of the year. But what we've seen so far is maybe a few less checks, but the checks that we're getting are larger than they've been before. So we're in a normal category, but the levels change.
Good. Thank you.
How are you projecting numbers for next year?
Well, our budget process starts like next month. But the biggest part of the projections here is really our grants. We will be looking at the grants that have been applied for that we're waiting to hear. We'll look at the grants that we've already got that carry over year to year and what level of work still needs to be done and so on. We'll be looking at grants that we've identified that we want to apply for. And then there's also situations where we've identified a situation out there, maybe a stream crossing that's a little rickety, that we might go find a grant to fix. So a lot of the projections have to do with grant development and projects that we identify. The contribution side of things tends to be newsletters go out, year-end appeals go out, things like that. And that number stays relatively steady, hopefully a growth each year. And then of course expenses, we manage carefully. Our major expense, these are the categories, but our major expense is salaries.
How much money have you been getting from the state of Michigan? They've indicated they're increasing their grant funding for a variety of water-related projects. So I'm assuming that's going to have a positive impact. I see you guys have picked up some grant money that way?
Yeah, I don't, a number of the grants come from various entities that are state sponsored. And I'm sorry, I don't have a number at hand of how much of that is state money, but if anybody else on staff knows, I think it's a pretty high percentage of the amount is state of Michigan funding in one way, shape, or form. Okay, thank you for the questions. Hopefully that helped everybody get a better understanding of what goes on and how we do it. With that, I'll bring Kim up.
Good morning. It's very nice to see so many familiar faces here today. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kim Baker and I'm the interim manager at the Watershed Council. Throughout my life, it's been difficult for me to say no, especially when friends ask me for help. And when I was asked to support the staff and the board during this time of transition, answering yes was once again the right decision for me. Over the past 4 months, my eyes have been opened on many levels, giving me real hope for the future of Northern Michigan. Before I retired as the executive director of Manna Food Project in Harbor Springs, I often spoke of the caring community in which we live. We live in a special place where individuals and businesses, community and family foundations, and service groups like Rotary and Kiwanis step up to the plate with tremendous support for those in need. I think of the significant work of the Women's Resource Center, Challenge Mountain, the Nehemiah Project for the Homeless right here in Petoskey. What I've learned in my short time at the Watershed Council is that our caring community extends well beyond our neighbors in need. It extends to our lakes, our rivers, our streams. So I want to thank you, each of you, for all that you do to care for our fragile environment and for the waterways that support our life and our way of life. What I want to leave you with this morning is a very simple message. From my perspective, the Watershed Council is heading in the right direction and poised for a very, very positive future. I say this with confidence because of the staff that I'm going to introduce you to. You'll notice that as they stand up, you'll notice that many of them are young professionals, some with years of experience in their field. All are highly motivated, fully trained in their areas of expertise, whether that's specialists in water quality, invasive species, shoreline restoration, environmental advocacy, and youth and community education. So I'd like to introduce you to your team in alphabetical order. First is Corey Alaniz, operations specialist. Most of them are in the back there. Eli Baker, education manager. Calla Beers, water resources and communications specialist. Kevin Chrisman, finance director. Lauren Dye, watershed programs director. Andrea Coronado, communications and development director. Marcella Damka, water resources manager. Noah Jansen, restoration manager. Emily Johnson, water resources specialist. Anna McGlashan, local policy manager. Jennifer McKay, chief policy and governmental affairs director. Natalie Watts, our office manager, and Anna Watson, water resources specialist. So please welcome. they're our future, and it's an absolutely wonderful group of people, and they formed quite a team and worked so well together. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll turn it back to Tom.
Right, at this point, I'd like to entertain a motion to close the business meeting so we can get on with the program. Is there a motion to close the business meeting? So moved, is there a second? There's a second. Moved and seconded, all right. All in favor of closing the business meeting, say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, business meeting is closed. We move on with the program. We're running a little ahead of schedule, so I think we'll just step right into it. And we begin with a report from Noah Jensen, our restoration coordinator. Noah has been with the Watershed Council since 2022. He promotes and designs rain gardens, green stormwater infrastructure, nature-based shoreline protection. He also works to enhance stream habitat through improvements to road stream crossings and dam removals. He provides support on managing invasive species. He has a master's degree in forest ecology from the University of Florida. Before joining our team, he served as the conservationist for the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians for nearly 8 years, where he led land management and invasive species efforts and spearheaded a project to help the tribe's forests better adapt to climate change. Please welcome Noah.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to just take a few minutes to talk about 2 shoreline restoration projects that we completed this past year. And the first one is at the East Jordan City Tourist Park. So this was done as a training for shoreline contractors in October of last year. And we did this as like a 2-day workshop, basically, where people could get a little bit of classroom training and some hands-on experience in installing bioengineering. We had 23 participants, and that included a lot of shoreline contractors, but we also had quite a few relatively new staff from EGLE, from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, that wanted to see how bioengineering installations happened on the ground and learn more about it. We restored 200 linear feet of shoreline using bioengineering methods that utilize quarry logs, fieldstone, and also, of course, our native plants. And so that site is down here. Here's East Jordan, and the tourist park is over here. It's kind of hard to see, but we actually were working out on this little point of land that kind of protects the boat basin, if you're familiar with that area at all. And also just want to acknowledge our project partners, the Michigan DNR and the City of East Jordan and Lake Charlevoix Association. So this is what the site looked like prior to restoration. So there was a lot of concrete slabs that had been sort of haphazardly dumped on the shoreline to try to prevent some erosion. But they weren't really doing their job, especially as the high waters came up in 2019 and 2020. And you can see there's a lot of erosion of where it used to be, lawn grass back here, essentially is now just been eroded away. This schematic kind of shows in cross section of what we did in terms of restoring the shoreline. So you have our quarter log or coconut fiber log here that helps hold that soil in place behind it. We have our native plants that the roots are going to grow and expand into that quarter log and down into the stone and hold everything together. And because this is a high energy system with lots of wave energy, we also have a fieldstone revetment here that is helping to break up some of that wave energy that's coming in. And a filter layer of gravel that keeps the sediment in place underneath that stone. Here's a couple of pictures of the installation. My former coworker Jennifer Buchanan here is instructing the participants in the proper way to install the toe stones for that fieldstone revetment in this picture. And on the right hand side you can see some of the participants pounding in stakes to secure the quarter log. Unfortunately, at the end of the training, we even with 20-some people working, we still had work that had to be done. So this is kind of where we ended up at the end of that workshop. We had our coir log completely in place. We had our filter layer of the gravel, but the field stone still needed to be completed, and we hadn't done any of the planting yet. So in November 9 and 10, some of our staff worked with some volunteers. We completed that field stone installation. We got a few native shrub seedlings planted, as well as some live stakes. And that was kind of as far as we got that year because of the constraints on the growing season and what we were able to do. But we still had some money in the grant, so at the end of this past June, we worked with volunteers from Lake Charlevoix Association, and we planted an additional 500 seedlings of native plants and also installed mulch at the site. So this is what it looks like today. So we have some string fencing to try to keep out the geese from going that down. If you've been out there at all, you'll know that they're quite a nuisance. But the stone held up really well over the winter, and we even have some of our live stakes here that have sprouted in the bottom right of the picture there. So it's been doing really well. The second project I want to talk about is a restoration at the Camp Petasiga Canoe and Kayak Launch. And this one was also done last October, a couple of weeks later, and also as a training for shoreline contractors. This one is part of the Certified Natural Shoreline Professionals training, which is put on through the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. And in this case, we restored 55 linear feet of shoreline using a different technique called encapsulated soil lifts. Again, I want to acknowledge our project partners, Emmett County, the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and Michigan's Now Point Source Program, and also the Environmental Protection Agency. And Camp Petasiga, if you're not familiar with it, is right here at the east end of Pickerel Lake. This is what the shoreline looked like prior to restoration. So there had been sort of a number of these embayments or scallops in the shoreline created that had eroded away. And you'll also notice that there's this access road that's really close to the water's edge. And because of that constrained space, we weren't able to kind of regrade that slope at a more gentle angle. And because of that, we decided to use a method called encapsulated soil lifts. Basically what we have with this technique is there's an erosion control blanket that kind of wraps around a layer of backfilled soils and holds that in place while the plants are getting stabilized and the slope is stabilizing. And in this case, we used a product called Bio-D blocks, which have an integrated biodegradable erosion control blanket, and then a coir fiber block, and then another integrated blanket on top of that. So those get staked into place on the bottom, you backfill the soils, and then you stake the top blanket in place, and you do that kind of in a series of terraces that step back from the water. We also had a small fieldstone revetment in front of that just to protect the base of that, and a little filter layer of gravel again to create a good foundation. Here's a couple of pictures from the installation. So we have our crew putting down the gravel layer here that's going to create that foundation. On the right side, you can see they're starting to stake in this first course of the soil lifts. And here we are a little further along, so the fieldstone revetment is mostly in place at this point. The first layer of the soil lifts has been installed, and they're working on the second here. You can see these folks are tamping down some of that backfilled soil so that we don't get settling later. And of course, the native plants are again a key component of this method as well. So in this site, we installed 500 or so plugs of native plants. And this is kind of what it looked like as a finished project last fall. The county also put in a nice split rail fence, so that kind of helps keep out both vehicle traffic, like when the plows come through in the winter and they can't see exactly where the edge is, and also just people from thinking, oh, these are nice steps, I'll just walk down here. I have been back. I don't have any more recent pictures, but I have been back, and it's held up really well over the winter. The plants are really thriving and doing great. So with that, do we have a couple minutes for questions? Yeah.
Could you name the native plants that you use?
I won't be able to remember them all, but we use nine barks, silky dogwoods, red osier dogwoods, meadow sweet. Those are the shrubs that we use. In this site we have big leaf aster, smooth aster, swamp aster. There's grassleaf goldenrod, columbine, wild strawberry, Canada rye. Yeah, and then the other site, I think we had some additional species that there was some coreopsis there. Yeah, and I'm forgetting a lot of the other ones. I can do that.
No, the first one where you were rolling out the compacted stuff in the steps, is that something that someone could purchase somewhere if they even wanted to do a small project?
Yeah, but this project here?
Yeah, like the steps. That came, it looked like it came like already packed together, the soil, or whatever it is made out of. I don't know what it's made out of.
Go back a couple slides.
You can get the Coir products at different places. They're hard to, they can be kind of hard to find. I ordered these directly from the manufacturer, which is Rolanka, and then they had to be trucked up here.
What are they actually made out of?
They're made out of the fiber from coconut husks.
Oh, we all knew that, right? Very good.
Yeah, so they're fully biodegradable. They last for the logs and the rectangular faces of these lifts will last for somewhere between 6 to 10 years before they break down, and in that time they just give the plants a chance to get established, and their roots will grow in there and then take over that job of holding soil in place. Yeah. Richard?
Did you, when you plant the plugs in, do you have to keep those things watered till they're established?
So if you can water them, that is really helpful. So if you have access to, a sprinkler or some kind of irrigation, that really helps. In this case, we didn't really have that as an option. So fortunately, they're doing well. We've got enough rain this summer that the plants have done really well. So, yeah.
I have two questions. Can you point on the slide where your original shoreline was that you built out from on that? And then, because I'm kind of losing perspective on
okay.
Like how much like ground did you reclaim, I guess is the question. And then how much does something like that cost to do?
Okay, so for your first question, like the shoreline kind of went like from this point here and then kind of back and kind of in a series of scallops. And so depending on, like at the water's level, we probably brought it back out to maybe like 6 to 8 feet. And then there was more sort of erosion on the slope happening that was corrected as well. And as to the cost, I want to say that I think just for the materials on these projects, it was around $100, $120 per foot. So then with labor, that is probably double or triple that if you're like working with a contractor or something. So that's just kind of a ballpark figure for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
What agencies or government departments have jurisdiction in terms of the permits or something?
Okay, that's a great question. So first, if you're doing any work on the shoreline that's below the ordinary high water mark, you need a joint permit from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE, and it's also through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's called a joint permit because there's one application and then both agencies approve that. Second is you will need a soil erosion permit, and that's usually from the county. or sometimes as a conservation district will issue those. And that is anytime you're doing soil disturbance that's within, I think, a set distance, 500 feet of the water tanks come. So then you need, because we're disturbing the soil here, you need a permit from them as well. So there may be other local regulations depending on where you're at as well.
And so for the joint permit, you said if it's
below the ordinary high water mark.
Yeah. And just in follow-up, the soil erosion permits, do you find a variation in permits that are authorized by the various districts on the state in terms of some are fairly permissive while others are not?
I've only worked with two different counties, so I don't have a great answer for that, but yeah, that could be, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Going forward, is there a monitoring program?
So in both cases here, the entities that own the land are responsible for maintenance ongoing. I anticipate that I'll be back, periodically just to keep an eye on things and, make recommendations if I see, something needs to be done. But the city of East Jordan and Emmett County parks are going to be responsible for that maintenance.
Eagle is real interested in these green types of solutions. So they might even pay for a monitoring program because not much is known about the longevity of these and if they work the way they're intended to. So, since you're grant-based, don't miss an opportunity.
Yeah, great.
Going forward, do you have any projects in the works?
Similar projects. We don't, I believe, have anything quite like this lined up. We are working on a Greenbelt cost share program for homeowners on Burt, Crooked, Pickerel, and Douglas Lakes. So just some more of the planting part of the shoreline restoration at this point. So that's kind of our project right now. So, and also have some potential contracts for doing design work for homeowners that would do things similar to some of these projects coming up. Yeah.
So institutionally, though, this is as much about restoring those individual sites as it is about the leverage behind teaching a lot of contractors how to do it. Is that kind of how you end up in these places?
Yeah, I would say that's very true. So it's not just restoring this 55 feet. It's also the expanded impact of all those people being trained in methods like this. And also this is a public site. Both of them are very public sites. So it also serves as a demonstration for any visitors that visit the parks to come and see, oh, this is what it can look like when you do natural shoreline restoration techniques.
So this is leveraged well beyond those single sites.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just step in as an example. This project that was done in East Jordan, one of the things I do is go to the planning commissions around Lake Charlevoix, and I've heard a number of times you can't use bioengineering on Lake Charlevoix because it's a high energy lake. We now have a place where we can show people that you can do it in a very high energy location. Energy on our inland lakes doesn't just happen in the summer with wake boats, it happens in the winter with ice.
Yeah.
Do you pass along the names of the organizations that participate in this program so that the public can be made aware of people who have taken an interest and made the effort, are knowledgeable in these things?
Yeah, so...
No, would you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so the question was, do you pass along the names of people that have gone through the training? That's kind of correct, right? So on the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership website, at the top of their webpage, it says find a contractor, and they have a list of all the people that have been through the Certified Natural Shoreline Professionals training. So that's where I usually refer people when they are looking for someone to do this kind of work. So, yeah.
Along those lines, do you put any kind of marker out that says this area restored by tip of the mid, Michigan Natural Shoreline, all that, at least a temporary one, so people going by can say, oh, this looks like it was newly done, I'll watch it and learn from it?
Yeah, that's something that we typically do. So far, we don't have any signage up there yet, but I'm hoping we can address that soon. Yeah.
Yes, on the earlier site, there were some concrete pieces that weren't there originally, right? Did you have to haul those out?
Yes, so the city got their excavator in there and hauled all those out for us, so that was a big help. Hauled out all that broken concrete. Yeah.
I know this is maybe more of a comment. It sounds like there are a number of people in the audience who are interested in this kind of restoration. And these projects can perhaps be scaled. Debbie and I did one with Doug Fuller here. I'm not here as his agent. Give me a cut, Doug, if you get any work done. But that was probably 30 years ago, and it was not of the magnitude of the quarter logs that you have here. It was a much smaller, and it's still there. It's still functional. So for people interested in this, there's probably a way to scale this in some way that might be compatible with the budget.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. You know, most people don't have probably 200 plus feet of shoreline to restore. Hopefully, there are some, but if you have a smaller lot, this can definitely work on a smaller lot as well. So it's just just a matter of working that into the plans. So yeah, in the back, Sue.
Tip of the Mid provided us with a shoreline survey and met with individual members of the shoreline. How many other lakes participate in that particular service of Tip of the Mid?
So we've had, I think most of the lakes in our service area, or at least the bigger ones, have done a shoreline survey at some point in the past. And so we've done kind of similar things as we did with Larks Lake, working with some of those folks. And like our Greenbelt cost share program, for example, that was sort of done piggybacking on a shoreline of Burt Lake, shoreline survey of Burt Lake in 2022. That was completed. So we do try to capitalize on, hey, here's your shoreline results, and here's something that you can do about it. So, yeah.
I would just follow up with that because this comment is not necessarily directed to the people here, but we're finding that this is something that needs to be repeated over and over and over again, and that we have people who have benefited from the shoreline survey and yet are not willing to take the steps to go forward. So it's a big educational piece for us, and I know for you as well.
What is the shoreline survey?
So when we do a shoreline survey for lakes, typically we have our staff go around in kayaks all around the shoreline, and they look at different aspects of the shoreline. So one thing they look for is cladophora growth, which is a filamentous algae that, if it's found on the shoreline, can indicate excess nutrient inputs. They look at shoreline alterations like riprap and seawalls. They look at green belts, so like how much natural vegetation is there in sort of that buffer zone between the lake and the upland. There's a few other things I'm missing, I think, but that's kind of what we look at that for every parcel of property all around the lake. And then we report that back to the Lake Association. Usually every individual property owner gets their personal results. And then also they can access sort of a report looking at the big picture for the whole lake. Do you have? Okay. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Very impressive on the shoreline restoration. But you also mentioned that invasive species is a matter of interest. What are the principal concerns on which species, which invasives are your primary concerns now, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, that's a big question.
That'll be the last question.
Yeah. So we're still doing a fair bit with purple leaf strife. We help coordinate sale of biocontrol beetles every spring. Phragmites, of course, is still a big concern. We're also looking out for things like starry stonewort, which is sort of an up-and-coming aquatic algae that's invasive as well. I would say those are some of the biggest ones right now. Eurasian water milfoil and hybrid milfoil are still big issues for some of our lakes. And some of our lakes still don't have zebra or quagga mussels, so depending on where you're at, those can be one that to look out for as well. So, thank you.
All right, just to follow up a comment on the question about invasives, we do have a mobile boat washing project that Eli runs, and that's really intended at addressing the spreading of invasive species. Not only are we washing individual boats, but when we're set up at boat launches, it gets a dialogue going and alerts people to the risk of moving things around. And with that, we're going to take about a 5-minute break while we get set up for our advocacy program. I want to offer another thank you to Noah Jensen for his excellent presentation and for the important work that he's been doing and leading around the state. I take a particular pleasure in introducing the next part of our program. Jennifer McKay has been with the tip of the Mitt Watershed Council since May of 2005. I think she must have been like 12 years old or something. In any event, she's our policy director, and she's been a key player in the work of protecting and preserving the watersheds we serve and those to which we are connected. Her tireless devotion to science-based policy making is legendary. She serves on many boards and committees dedicated to preserving and protecting the Great Lakes and the state's waters, including Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition Governance Board, the Land Information Access Association Board of Directors, and the Emmett County Local Emergency Planning Committee. She's currently the chair of the Michigan Environmental Council Board of Directors. She was appointed by the Great Lakes Commission and the Michigan Underground Storage Tank Authority by Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She's previously served on the Michigan Pipeline Safety Advisory Board, having been appointed by Governor Rick Snyder. Over the years, she's worked very closely with my old friend Guy Meadows, who's also been involved in a lot of that work. Dr. Meadows received his PhD from Purdue University in 1977, having received undergraduate and master's degrees from Michigan State. Upon graduation from Purdue, Guy joined the faculty of the University of Michigan College of Engineering, where he served as a professor of physical oceanography for 35 years. His primary research interests, and I'm not sure I'll be able to pronounce all this, but I pulled it off his website, are the geophysical fluid dynamics with emphasis on environmental forecasting and full-scale Great Lakes and coastal ocean experimental hydrodynamics. Yeah. When I first met Guy in the early 80s, running his model of Lake Superior hydrodynamics required the entire computing capacity of the University of Michigan for 8 minutes. He was a junior professor at the time, and as I remember the story, his allotted time was usually 3 a.m. on Monday morning. In 2012, Guy was recruited by Michigan Tech to be the first director of their Great Lakes Research Center, a position from which he recently retired. Guy's work has influenced policy and has explored societal impacts of environmental forecasting for coastal management, recreational health and safety, and regional climate change. As important, he continues to serve as a model and mentor for young people entering STEM fields, including my son, who now works as a technical monitor for the NOAA Great Lakes Restoration Initiative program in Ann Arbor. Guy and his wife, Laurel, who is also Dr. Meadows, is herself a dedicated science and educator, now reside at the northern end of the Keweenaw Peninsula and run their boat from a slip in Copper Harbor doing research along the shores of Isle Royal. Guy and Jennifer are going to treat us to a reflective conversation about the challenges and rewards of advocating for the Great Lakes at all levels of government. Please welcome them.
Thank you, Tom. So as Tom mentioned, when I first started working for the Watershed Council 18 years ago, just a little older than 12, I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. And this was despite having worked for the House and the Senate down in Lansing. I had no idea the depth and breadth of the issues I would work on, or what I would be expected to become an expert in. I've, over the years, helped to save the Michigan Wetlands Program, written state and federal legislation, protected northern Michigan waters from contamination and development proposals. Worked on Line 5 for over a decade, on the same board with Dr. Guy Meadows here that we were both appointed by the governor. It's important to recognize, though, the policy and advocacy world, I don't work alone. You were already introduced to her, but we do have a local policy manager, Anna McGlashan. Is she here? All the way hiding in the back. So she's responsible for the majority of our local policy efforts. So local ordinance work, development proposals, review of permit applications for our entire 4-county service area. We also work in very close coordination with our watershed protection team. They provide us with the science and the on-the-ground knowledge that is the foundation for our policy work. And we work with so many partners, the lake associations that are represented here, other nonprofits, other state, federal, tribal agencies, and academia. And the partnership with academia will be the focus of our discussion here today. As the keynote speaker, Dr. Meadows, has worked in collaboration with the Watershed Council and myself on numerous issues over the years to advance the protection of our Great Lakes. So before we dive into it, I just want to explain what policy and advocacy means for the Watershed Council. The definition of advocate is one who supports or defends a cause, and 2, one who speaks on another's behalf. So it's that desire to protect our region's water. It comes from our heart. It's the love of clean water and the fierce desire to prevent it from degradation. It means studying an issue until you can recite the facts in your sleep. It means driving an hour in a cold, snowy evening to a township hall to provide a 3-minute comments testimony on a development project that might impact fragile wetlands or impact a local lake. It is protecting our region's waters. It's everyone's business because it benefits all of us. And it's something we must do. Our lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands, they have no voice in our political or economic system. And so it's often advocacy from us, all of us, that has to be the voice for that water. And since 1979, when the Watershed Council was founded, we've been willing to speak on behalf and for those waters. That means a number of activities, commenting on those individual development proposals, reporting potential violations to uphold the environmental laws, ensuring effective laws and regulations are preserved. We don't shy away from working on the state or federal levels and weighing in on issues that might be controversial. All along the way, we use our mission as a guide. We work with concerned citizens, prepare education materials, prepare policy guidance for local, state, and federal agencies, develop coalitions across the entire Great Lakes Basin, represent Northern Michigan and Lansing and Washington, D.C., and all along the way, we're bringing science and legal expertise to local water decisions. And at the very foundation is the Watershed Council's sound technical and scientific information through policy and legal analysis. So Tom already took the opportunity to introduce Guy, but as I mentioned, we've served on multiple boards together. We've also managed to put him to work, whether he likes it or not. Just recently, he was appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to serve on an environmental permit review commission because we asked him and thought his skills would be extremely knowledgeable. So he often gets put to extra work thanks to us. So again, thank you for being here. Welcome. Before we dive into the full conversation, what wisdom can you share on the role of advocacy protecting the Great Lakes?
Thank you, Jennifer. First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to meet with you today. I've known Jennifer for a lot of years, and before we first met face to face, I knew of her. She has a tremendous reputation. That reputation is for pushing people out of their comfort zone. And, I'm used to standing up to give lectures, and I was really hoping to do a regular lecture here, and I could put half of you to sleep within 20 minutes, but she's pushed me to have a discussion, so I'm pretty excited about that. So it's been an absolute pleasure working with her on mutual things that we care about, and she's right. It comes from your heart, and I've been trying to retire now for about 3 years, but it's just a hard thing to do when there's so much still needed to be done. And to get to your question, advocacy is the way to get things done. And we both spend a lot of time meeting with individual people, and in my particular role to try and describe how the natural systems along our coastline work in a way that you could understand them. So that, I've been working on this stuff for 40-some years, and I'm just trying to, getting to the point to figure it out now. So if you need to make snap decisions, you don't have 45 years to try to figure out how it really works. So a lot of what I do is to try and educate, and that starts at the top. It starts with the directors of Eagle and the Corps of Engineers, and I just went through a big fight the city of Marquette wanted to do. Where's Noah? The city of Marquette wanted to do exactly what Noah did with this submerged cobblestone breakwater to give access to the water, and Eagle was trying to force them to build a revetment. And again, it took education and advocacy to convince Eagle that you have to get away from these giant stone structures. They're doing more damage than good. So been working on those kind of things, and really the tip of the Mitt Watershed Council has just been a tremendous model to follow in terms of being very successful in maneuvering through this very difficult sea of bureaucrats that run our water lines.
Thank you, Guy. So we're going to have a conversation. I get to ask my questions first, and then towards the end, I'll let all of you ask your questions. So if you think of something, please write it down so you remember it. But the Watershed Council is known for basing policy positions on sound science. And we rely upon research and information from our watershed protection team and partners such as you, where we can provide better guidance and recommendations and suggested legislative language. So for example, the Watershed Council receives copies of all permit applications submitted to the state and federal government within our 4-county service area. That would be the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. When we get those, our goal is to review them to make sure that they meet the letter of the law, but primarily to minimize adverse impacts to the lakes, streams, wetlands, or Great Lakes. And we use the on-the-ground specific knowledge that we have, and the fact that we're one of the leading nonprofits in what Noah just discussed, bioengineering, to very specifically make recommendations. In particular, during the high waters we just had in 2019-2020, we relied upon decades of research conducted by Dr. Meadows in an attempt to not only educate property owners and members of the community, but influence decisions of the permitting staff and elected officials. Can you please talk about your decades of research on the fluctuating water levels in the Great Lakes and how your research has and can be used to combat the practices that harm the health of our waters?
Thank you. I've taken the liberty to put some slides together and try and demonstrate some of these concepts, so bear with me. I've been a professor a long time. So back in 1997, we published this paper in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. And what it is the relationship between Great Lakes water levels and wave energy. And this is a graph of wave energy through time, and I know they're small, but it runs from 1959 to 1990 across the bottom. So on the order of 30 or 40 years or so. And this is a smooth line of water levels. So what we found is that there is about an 18-month, year and a half difference between when wave energy start rising and when water level begins to rise. And what that really means, I mean, that's a fascinating little fact, but what it means is the wave energy incident in our shorelines, and Tom made a good point, the big lakes, well, I'm going to talk mostly about the Great Lakes themselves, but large inland lakes like Lake Charlevoix and the other lakes in these areas, they see the same thing. The energy of the wave is related to wave height squared. So it's all about how big the waves are. So if the waves are smaller, as they are in Lake Charlevoix than they are in Lake Michigan, that doesn't mean the processes don't go on. It means that that just happens slower and does not to the extent that it happens on the Great Lakes. So the inland waters there are just as important and susceptible to this as the Great Lakes themselves. Well, what it means is, if you look, wave energy actually increases 25% from low water level years to high water level years. And what causes that is we start seeing more storms and more intense storms about 2 years before we start to see water levels rise. And when water levels are high, the wave energy is significantly greater, 25% is a big number, greater than it is during the years of low lake levels. So the shoreline takes a double hit. It takes very large waves crashing into the snow to the shoreline, and that energy has to be dissipated somewhere. And it goes into moving sediments and wrecking boats and drowning people and things like that. But again, with the water level high, it changes the place where those waves are able to do their work. It puts it in the worst possible place. It puts it up against the bluff lines and that sort of thing. The natural beach has a mechanism to deal with that. It gives up sand that is stored in the upland part of the beach, the part you walk on, and it moves out into sandbars offshore. And the purpose of those sandbars is to break these bigger waves as they come in, break it on the third bar, break it on the second bar, break it on the first bar. So there is nothing more dissipative to these big waves that happen during the high water years than the beach itself. And if you do things to not allow the beach to be able to give sand from the visible part of the beach and store it offshore, then you lose that ability to dissipate those incoming waves. And then when water levels go down, that sand gets pushed back up on the shore and is restored again. So there's this big process going on that has taken us a long time to kind of figure out. What's interesting is across the bottom, those bars are the Corps of Engineers' estimate of shoreline damage. And the point is, the greatest shoreline damage occurred with the peak in the waves, not the peak in water level. So the shoreline damage really comes from the waves doing that work and the increase in the energy associated with those waves. Long answer, but, so that was back in 1997, and that was leading up to the high water of 1986. So, as Tom indicated, when they built the Great Lakes Research Center, they were smart enough to put in a supercomputing cluster, which has allowed us to do marvelous things on the Great Lakes. So this is redoing that with the most recent rise in water level, 40-year period coming up to the highs that we just saw in 2009, 19, and 20. And this is for Lake Michigan. But again, you see the same thing. You see the rise in wave energy 2 years ahead of the rise in water level. And that's happening all over the lake. These are locations where the buoys are at. So this is along both north to south along the Michigan shoreline, as well as north to south along the Wisconsin shoreline. So we've seen the same thing twice now in two of these high level record-setting water level situations. So, you know, when we have high water levels, we have storminess leading up to that is increased. And living in Lake Superior, it's been real windy for the last year. All the folks that have lived there far longer than I have is like, oh, have you ever seen so much wind? Wow. So we might be starting to see the forerunners of another rise in water level. So it may not stay low for 14 years like it did before the first one. So we're watching that very closely. Thanks.
Thank you. Fantastic information. And it is this type of research, and then what we see on the ground and document on the ground, that we use when we decide what type of projects to work on. And we took on a project in partnership with the Lake Charlevoix Association and LIA, the Land Information Access Association, recently on Lake Charlevoix, where we're working with all 10 of the local municipalities around it to address shoreline protection. What we saw during the high waters was that, one, there's not a vision, long-term vision for the lake. People make snap decisions when we see the high waters. They're not thinking about the long-term health of the lake, what's going to happen in 15 years, 30 years. So we wanted to get everyone to start thinking long-term, and also work with them on what challenges they were facing with respect to shoreline protection. We had worked with them on a previous project that ended in 2016 that focused solely on ordinances. So we wanted to go back and obviously talk about ordinances, but what else were they experiencing? Education problems, enforcement issues, and so we've done 2 rounds meeting with all of the local municipalities where we could hear from them on what were the issues, what were their concerns, what is their long-term vision, and we're providing recommendations for Lake Charlevoix. It will include recommendations for all of the municipalities as a whole, lake-wide recommendations. It'll provide recommendations that will require more depth and conversation between all the municipalities, and then individual recommendations for each local unit of government to implement. And hopefully that will be done very soon. But there's already interest in some other lakes taking a similar approach, trying to work collaboratively on a lake-wide basis. And it's thanks to the research and on-the-ground efforts that we have. And so, you know, we brought you in to assist with our local protection advocacy efforts, such as that. You know, at the start of our Lake Charlevoix visiting project, we hosted a Lake Charlevoix Day to start out with a very broad education effort. And you were part of that. You were one of our primary speakers. How else have you assisted other communities, such as ours?
Well, you know, your problems are not unique. I mean, these are occurring all over the Great Lakes. And we, for the Lake Charlevoix project, we took a look at the similarities of what is happening on the Big Lake versus what's happening on Lake Charlevoix. And you see areas of accumulation of sediment, you see engineering structures that have impacts on the shoreline. We have also created, with funding from Eagle, this shoreline through time. So we have done now all of the Lake Michigan shoreline, all of the Lake Huron shoreline, a little bit of the Lake Erie shoreline, and most of the Lake Superior shoreline. So this is an open website, and I'll give you in a future slide here, I'll give you the link to it, but it's designed for you. You can go to this slide and you can look at what your shoreline has done since 1938 up to 2020 in several steps where there was aerial photograph of the quality that could go down to individual properties. So you can zoom into your individual property and see how things have changed from 1938 to almost to the present. All the little airplanes, those are oblique photographs taken from airplanes instead of looking straight down at the shoreline like the photograph there that makes the base of this map. You can see what it looks like from the water looking in. So it's a really handy thing. But what it really does is it allows you to see what the long-term erosion rates are. The brighter the color, the worse it is. And your area, you know, is very, very stable compared to what happens in the southern part of Lake Michigan. So you're in a better spot than most are with respect to that. But in looking at these erosion rates, it brings to bear the fact that the Great Lakes are new features geologically. They took their present shape about 12,000 years ago as the glaciers were retreating. So that means they're new features, they're steep-sided, and they're deep. And the natural process is to get wider, and we call that shoreline erosion, and to eventually fill in the deep parts of the lake. So that background erosion goes on independent of what we do to mess up or alter the shoreline. And it's about a foot per year. So that's something that even Eagle wasn't aware of till relatively recently, that the lakes do these things. And then in certain areas, we exacerbate that by our shoreline construction. So, you know, when you see bright colors in this photograph, it means that the shoreline is changing, you know, at a rate greater than about 1 foot per year. So these are some shots. This is area on the tip of nearing the tip of the Leelanau Peninsula in your area. There's some areas that have changed pretty significantly. You can see the blue line there showing shoreline at 1938 and where it is at the present time. So that's not much change, really. And you can see there, it's a natural shoreline. So there are large-scale changes that happen even without structures along the shoreline. Some area sands comes from some area and is moved to other areas, and that's done again by waves. This is Christmas Cove in that area, two different time spans. You can see there they built a real nice access point, nice parking lot, and then they lost about half of that in the right diagram during the high water in this most recent episode. So there are changes happening everywhere along the shoreline, and if we live on the shoreline, and I confess I do too, we must expect change.
Thanks. So part of advocacy is trying to get either the state or federal governments to institute policies for the long-term protection of the lakes. And we pulled you into conversations with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy to discuss long-term strategies for trying to address water levels. Historically, the response by the state of Michigan has been to respond when it's an emergency situation. So when water levels are high, we issue permits frantically for large seawalls and riprap. And when water levels go low, we're issuing permits for dredging. Can you explain the efforts we need on the state level to actually holistically manage or view the Great Lakes to better protect them?
You're absolutely right. And having, our work started seriously with the states right after the high water level in 1986. They commissioned us to establish along the Lake Michigan shoreline and also along the Lake Huron shoreline, but along the Lake Michigan shoreline, 36 permanent locations where once a year we would survey from the top of the dune out to a depth of about 30 feet offshore. And we did that for 20 years, so that's how I spend my summers. And trained a lot of students in the process. But the state was just as unprepared in 1986 as they were again in 2020. So if you, and I really enjoyed the financial talk here at the beginning, if you track our research devoted towards shoreline, understanding the shoreline, as the water level goes up, so does the funding. And then when the water level goes down, the funding goes away. And remember, this last low period lasted 14 years. So everybody forgot about these problems. And a lot of turnover in the state and a lot of new people, and now they're learning it all over again. So I'm going to jump to, you were talking about other part of your question was what other areas have we been participating in. And part of that is the Sea Grant programs of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, for the first time 3 years ago, decided to pool their resources and actually work together. And they put a request for proposals out to take a comprehensive look at all of Lake Michigan. And we partnered with University of Wisconsin-Madison, with Purdue, and with Michigan Tech, and we were fortunate enough to win that big project. So we're in the process and just finishing that up now. But our part of the process was to look at these medium-sized harbors, and South Haven is a convenient one to look at, but there's what we define as a medium-sized harbor is a harbor like these that have the end of their recreational jetties at the depth of the second sandbar. And if you can look at all four of these, Pentwater, Leland, Arcadia, and South Haven, they all have that. In fact, there's about 13 harbors up the Michigan coastline that are fit this definition of a medium-sized harbor. So what that means is, as these wave energies get increasing with high water level, it not only erodes a lot of sediment off the shoreline, but as we said, the beach is putting that out in the second and third bars. So that's right at the mouths of all of these harbors. So we call that the plight of the medium-sized harbors. What happens is these harbor jetties, even though they're small, they are depositing sand out in deeper water than the sand would naturally get deposited. So we're actually losing sediment from the nearshore zone. And the same thing, but to a greater extent, is happening at the big commercial harbors like St. Joe, Benton Harbor, and Muskegon. They are deflecting sand off a great deal out to sea. Where does our sand come from? We don't have a coastal mountain range like California, so there's no erosion in the mountains and delivering sand at the river mouths. Our sand for our beaches comes from shoreline erosion. And as we do more things to shut off and occupy the shoreline, we shut off that supply of sand. And if sand is also being not supplied, but also being lost to the offshore by structures like this that deflect sand offshore, we're losing a natural resource along the shoreline. So we either live with that situation and recognize it, or we need to, where possible, bring that sediment back to the shoreline. And that has been done in various places in the United States. Miami Beach would not exist without beach nourishment, taking the sand that's offshore and putting it back on shore. And the Outer Banks of North Carolina just finished an episode of restacking their beaches, which they do once every 5 years. So again, we need to think about the implications both ways. Do we want to mess with nature? Do we want to try and recover that sediment from offshore and bring it back? Or is that going to do more damage than good? And those types of questions are what we're trying to take a long view with the state of it.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit on you. A large part of advocacy is education. And decision makers need accurate information and science-based information to evaluate policy options. We have been working hard to do this with respect to septic system management and regulation. We currently are taking our local knowledge and using it at the state level for legislation on a statewide septic code. We're one of the only, if not the only, organizations working on the statewide septic code that actually has the local knowledge of how things work on the ground. We have a septic subcommittee, which some of the people in this room have been on for years, and have worked hard at getting local ordinances. And we can use the information from the local ordinances and how they have worked and our interactions with septic haulers and the health departments, and actually use the on-the-ground information, how things are actually working to benefit and to make state bills better. Hopefully, by doing so, we will be improving legislation and protecting not only our waters here in northern Michigan, but all of the waters throughout the state of Michigan. And in situations like that, you were responsible for a much larger effort when the state of Michigan asked you to provide the economic, environmental, and cultural impacts of a worst-case scenario spill or release from the Enbridge Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac. We served on the Michigan Pipeline Safety Advisory Board for a short time before you had to take leave to go perform this significant study.
There's a story behind this.
It was a very significant effort involving researchers, 40 or more researchers from over different universities with varied expertise. How is it to work on that risk analysis, knowing how important that report was to the future of the state of Michigan, and yet at the same time knowing how controversial the issue of Line 5 was and is in the state?
Okay, I got out of sync here, so I'm going to finish up. This is what I promised you before. This is the website to get on and to see how your shoreline has changed over the last 80-some years. So we welcome you to hop on there and take a look at that and play with it. It's constantly evolving, but it's hopefully a really good tool that can be used to educate not only the state but also individual groups about how their shoreline is being viewed. And then here are some examples from M County. I'm going to skip over those, but this one I do want to talk about a little bit before I answer your question, because my fault, I get messed up. So I told you we started these surveys right after high water in 1986. So we started the surveys, first ones in 1987, and this is all the lines for this particular location. I've chosen this one to show you because it's just to the south of the harbor at New Buffalo, a very small, tiny little recreational harbor that still has major impacts on the downdrift side. And in particular, our line there in the upper, our survey line is this red line up here, located right here. And it's significant because that's where the beginning of the revetment starts. And if you go south out of New Buffalo, it is constant revetment with maybe 1% of natural beach left, all the way to the Indiana line. It is just constant revetment. So we looked from 1986, all these different colored lines are how much the near shore zone changed. And you see that we always have this third bar out here and a little bit of sand deposited out there. Well, with the revetments, and this has happened at every place that is revetted, that in the 2020, we went back and resurveyed these in 2020, the green line. The nearshore bars have totally been obliterated. And then sand has been driven further offshore than we've ever seen it before and piled up here. And we see this over and over again. So it's not only the harbor structures, but it's also the shoreline revetments that are driving sediment out into deeper and deeper water. And that's what's making us wonder about what should we do about that, if not anything. And this is a small operation when the Corps of Engineers dredges the commercial harbor at St. Joe Harbor. They allowed the city for the first time to buy in on some extra dredging. So they put the dredge spoils back on the beach here, but they allowed the city to, at the same price per cubic yard, to actually buy more dredging, which helps the Corps of Engineers. They don't have to dredge as often, but they're able to put beach nourishment back on the beach and rebuild their beach. Let's skip that. All right, the pipeline. So Jennifer's seat on this commission was to represent the environmental issues. My seat was to represent the 13 state universities of the state and bring to bear what knowledge the universities have with respect to this very complicated problem. So Jennifer and I and a few other really dedicated people went to work on creating the scope of work for two major projects. One was a alternatives analysis, that is, if you're going to transport the same amount of petroleum to refineries, what other ways might you do it other than a pipeline, and what are the risks associated with doing it other ways, and what is the best way to do it. And that contract was, we scoped it out, very detailed scope of work, and that went out for bid, and a company won the bid and went to work on it. Well, we did the same thing for the risk analysis, and the risk analysis is what is the worst case scenario. And if you look around, this is set up like a clock. This is the substance of the scope of work, but set in the order that you have to do it. And the way you have to do it is you have to decide on what the worst case scenario is, and there is very strict federal rules about this. The pipelines are monitored by the Department of Transportation. So the worst case scenario has to be feasible, and it has to be realistic. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But then the goal is, once you decide how much oil is going to be spilled in a worst case scenario, the next step is freight transport. Where does it go? And then if you follow on around the clock, it's once you know where it's going to go, what is going to be the environmental damage, what is going to be the human damage, what is going to be the cost, what is the cleanup, what is how much could be restored in the future years, and all the way around this whole thing. And then you add it all up in the end and decide what the sum total of all of these costs, including human health and environmental health and all this stuff. And we wrote this with great intensity, and with the goal that we would never have to do this, but a consulting company would, and the same process was followed. The scope of work went out, we had a bunch of bids, we went through it all, and picked a team that we thought would do the best possible job on this massive operation. And then they went to work, and 2 weeks before their draft report was done, so all the work was done, and their draft report was due to the state. It was found that they had a conflict of interest. They had people working for Enbridge as well as working on this at the same time. So, and that means the whole project was a year behind, because they had their whole year to do this. So, you put it a nice way. Another way to say it is, these guys all got together and thought it would be good if I would resign from the team and organize Michigan's universities to do this job. So that was a big undertaking in a lot of ways. Not only did we write it to be almost impossible to do, but we put together, and I'll go back to this one here, this shows everybody who participated, but we went around to all of Michigan's universities, public universities, as well as when we couldn't find experts in certain things, like how do you design underwater pipelines, we went to other places, South Dakota, where there's a lot of pipelines, and some folks from Arizona, and found the best people all across the United States to help us with it. So it was a sum total of 41 people who had never worked together before. Some of us had never met before, to organize to do this thing, and they gave us 6 months to do it, I think. So it worked out, I think, good. It was a tremendous undertaking, a lot of work for everyone. We put a tremendous team together, and as I said, the University, Michigan Tech, when they built the Great Lakes Research Center, they put in it a supercomputing cluster, which allowed us to do things that were infeasible to do any other way. But in summary, we suggested that the worst case scenario would be a bottom case, the severing of both pipelines by something like an anchor strike. We got a lot of pushback from everyone that, you know, that could never happen. That doesn't fit the criteria of being feasible, you know, because that's just way too far out, and then it happened. So this was right. I mean, under that situation, the worst case scenario was 58,000, is that right?
Yeah.
58,000 barrels. And what we were able to do, gosh, I keep getting messed up here. Anyway, I'm gonna just go ahead. That's okay.
Oh, please,
Yeah.
by all means.
All right, so in the, no, go ahead, ask your question. This is why I didn't want to do it this way. 48 years another way, it's hard to do it.
It was a very...
Puts everybody out of their comfort zone.
It was a tremendous report that came out with a lot of good information that actually was used by our government to initiate some of the shutdown orders that have yet to be fulfilled.
690 pages if you want to read it. It's on the state's website.
I've read the whole thing, actually. But in addition to providing that fantastic piece of work, that has also been instrumental in providing ways in which the state of Michigan could implement some of the provisions they put in agreements with Enbridge and the state for protective measures with respect to the fact that we still have an operating pipeline in the Straits of Mackinac. One of those is sustained weather conditions. So there's provisions on when, in fact, the weather conditions in the Straits are too dangerous for the pipeline to be under operation. And it became one of Guy's jobs, essentially, to determine how we monitor that. And so, Guy, can you please share the information you have on the buoys that are in place in the Straits and the results that you see from those buoys?
So we took the view that as the great debate continues for what to do with Line 5, that we should do everything in our power to make the Straits as safe as possible in the interim. We started by, picture on the left, was by purchasing an autonomous underwater vehicle, a torpedo-looking gizmo that is able to go away for up to 8 hours at a time and investigate the bottom. And we outfitted it with the highest resolution side scan sonar that you could purchase at the time. So this is, the picture on the left is a side scan sonar image of the pipeline, this long straight thing on the left. You can see when they built the pipeline, at various places they buried it under piles of material from the bottom. So seeing some looks on faces, this is the pipeline. And it gives you a view of how things are changing. We were able then to, with this, we developed a procedure to accurately measure unsupported sections of pipeline, how long they are, and Enbridge was required to measure the pipeline in unsupported lengths by the Department of Transportation, I think once every 10 years at that time, or maybe it was 5 years, but a long period of time. With this method, you could do each pipeline in a day. So you could come back and do it automatically and measure that stuff. So we turned that technology over to Enbridge, and they have commercial people that now do that. The other issue was it's very difficult to clean up spilled oil in big waves. In fact, the equipment doesn't work much over about 3-foot waves. So the question became, how often do you have big waves in the Straits? And the answer is about 10 times a year you have pretty good blows in there. So we started out by putting in this buoy, which NOAA helped us deploy, and it started operating right after the Pipeline Advisory Board did its work. And it measures waves and wind directions, and it also measures the flow underneath the water to see how fast the flows can be, because clearly sediment is moving along the bottom of there, so there has to be pretty good velocities in that flow. And then the upper buoy is a new addition that's been there for about 4 years. This one's on the north side of the shipping channel, and we wanted one on the south side. And this little round one only measures waves, but it is the gold standard for wave measurements. It's called a data well wave rider buoy, and they're used worldwide, and everyone agrees that they are the best. So since Enbridge entered into a agreement with the state because of advocacy to shut down the pipeline when the waves reach 8 feet. So every time the waves reach 8 feet, they shut down the pipeline. So we needed to know, is it 7.9 or is it 8.1? So the gold standard buoy became the go-to place. I just learned that 2 weeks ago it was hit by a boat, and it is now out of commission, but we've replaced it with another temporary buoy while it's being repaired, but it's a $65,000 buoy. So, yeah. So, and then the most recent thing, Tom mentioned my wife, Laurel. Her expertise is in high-frequency radar. And what high-frequency radar is, it was developed after during World War II. It was then called over-the-horizon radar. So the idea is you use radar waves that even though it says high frequency, it's really not high frequency. It's high frequency in World War II when it was above the radio band. But now high frequency is a totally different thing. So it's really low frequency, but that doesn't matter other than that it serves, it follows the Earth's curvature. So you can see kind of a long ways. And these are very common on the ocean coast for mapping surface currents. And on the ocean coast, they can go reach out 200 kilometers, 150 miles offshore. But there is far less electromagnetic coupling between the water surface and the Great Lakes because we don't have salt. So they only work about 5 miles on the Great Lakes. So NOAA, for a long time, said that's failure. We're not going to do these in the Great Lakes. 5 miles, who cares about 5 miles? And it took her 20 years to convince NOAA that this is the Straits of Mackinac. There's a need and the geometry is just right. So 3 years ago we were able to set up a pair of these radars, one on the north side, one on the south side. Here. Both buoys are in the footprint of the radars, and we set them up. These are west of the bridge, and as the little diagrams indicate, they're looking northwest for this one and southwest for that one. So this whole 5 mile square, you get once every half hour a total map of the surface currents. And in a few minutes I'll tell you why that's so important. Because the flow is constantly reversing in the Straits of Mackinac. If there's a spill, you need to know quickly which way the currents are going and where they're the strongest and that sort of thing. You see they're really strong here. We have NOAA now convinced, and they have the money for next year to put another pair looking to the east of the bridge, looking east. That'll be a cool thing. You asked about cleanup. So this is something out of the report we did for the state and the risk analysis. So under calm conditions, you can recover about as much oil by using the various processes of cleanup of oil on the surface, and Enbridge only transports light crude, so it does float as much as evaporates. So of the total amount of oil on the water, you can recover about a third will evaporate into the air, and about a third can be recovered. If under those same conditions, in our worst case scenario was this big storm when we did the analysis, we did it in 2018, but there was excellent records to drive the model for 2016, and NOAA had already prepared the weather 4 times a day for the entire year of 2016. So the worst case storm occurred 2 days after Christmas actually in 2016. So we thought that was really appropriate because nobody works between Christmas and New Year's, right? So, you know, that would be a good test of what could you really recover, and I'll show you some results of that. But in a storm of that magnitude where you had 10 to 12 foot wave, this is what you can recover versus this is what you can recover in calm situations. So the wave conditions in the straits really matter in terms of the efficiency of being able to recover stuff.
Thank you. So there were a number of individuals on the Pipeline Safety Commission that did not believe the 8-foot level was sufficient for protection. And this is where sometimes advocacy fails. It's not always perfect, where a number of us actually used the statistics and data from Enbridge's own equipment that they would use to clean up a spill, where it proved that 3 feet is when the equipment would stop working. To try and get that level of 8 feet down to 3 feet, and we were unsuccessful in doing so. So how often again is the waste?
About 10 times a year.
10 times a year.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's been borne out by the buoys. So, you know, it was a guess at that time, but now with the buoys in there, we have many, many years now of documentation as to exactly what the wave climate in the straits is.
You're gonna hate me because now I'm really gonna mess you up. Given the time, I'm gonna skip some of the questions.
Can I show my video?
You can show the video.
We were so hard to get this thing.
Yep, please show the video.
Okay. All right, so what you're going to see is this is one of 4,380 simulations we ran on the supercomputing cluster at Michigan Tech. And that number is 365 days, 4 times a day, the weather, we do the precise weather, and then we released fictitious particles to simulate oil at 3 locations, one in the center of the straits, one in the north side, and one in the south side. So if you multiply all those numbers together, you get 4,380 simulations. So this is one of the worst ones. Does this really work too?
Yeah, it does.
I know, it doesn't work for me.
Yeah,
Start this. And then pause. All right, so the green particles are those that have come up on shore. The red particles, there's 10,000 particles there. Those are the ones still being drifted around. And I stopped it as quick as I can. So this is 23 hours into this simulation. So let me see if I can back this up for a minute. So here we are, the center tab there, that 3 hours. So after the release, by 3 hours, it's already over to Bob Blanc and in the straits between Mackinac Island and Bob Blanc. So it moves very quickly. So what, you know, if this were to happen 2 days after Christmas, how much stuff can you get out in 3 days to catch this stuff? So just think about that while I let it run here. And just watch the numbers change and where it goes. And it shows you the percentage that's still drifting and the percentage that's gone to shore. So we're, right now, 83% has hit the beach already, and we're hours into it. So if you're gonna catch it out in the water and do some of the things in those other graphs that we saw, pick it up with the equipment, that sort of thing, you gotta be there. And stuff is stationed on both sides of the straits to allow some of that to happen, but again, this continues to go and actually goes into Canada, and we got some surprise reactions from Canada saying, oh, it affects us. Thank you for letting me do that.
Thank you. No, this is fantastic work that he's done, and really appreciate it. So, what are you currently working on, and what's on the horizon for the Great Lakes with respect to needed advocacy?
Yeah. And sorry for running long here, but you wanted me to talk. A couple things. So the GLRI, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, is a really good thing. And in the first couple of years of that, the federal folks that received the funds were willing to play nice in the sandbox and share. They actually set aside a portion of the GLR money that universities could compete for and do certain things that fit within the goal. Well, after the first couple of years, they decided it was just easier to keep it for themselves. So, you know, and being a grant, so just like you do, if we don't get money by grants, we don't get it anywhere. There's nobody feeding us. We don't get anything from the university. We are totally self-sufficient as a research organization. So one thing I think it would be great is if, you know, don't set aside money. We are not asking for gifts, but we want to compete with the feds on being able to do things like you see here. That, you know, with GLRI money to be able to have access to that, 350 million a year or something now.
It's up higher than that. We got it to 425, and we continue to advocate for full funding.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'd like to be able to compete in that environment. And then quickly, the other thing that I think we're getting shorted on is the federal agencies that fund the kinds of things that we need to do in the Great Lakes all have ocean in their title. National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, it's the Ocean Science Program of the National Science Foundation. We do a disservice by calling these the Great Lakes, so we go back to inland seas again, because they just don't get it in Washington, D.C. So IOOS, Integrated Ocean Observing System, which is what funds the buoys network in the Great Lakes and those kinds of things, the radars now, the maintenance of the radars and stuff is all funded by that. And our regional association is CLAW. It's called GLOSS, the Great Lakes Observing System. And there are 13, I think, of regional associations, but the Great Lakes one is 8 states combined. And our shorelines are, of the Great Lakes that way, are greater than the Atlantic shoreline and the Gulf of Mexico shoreline added together. So California has 2, and both of those regional associations are funded greater than the Great Lakes. In fact, we are the absolute bottom of the pile, and the next one above us is Puerto Rico. So there's a job for advocacy to get the 8 Great Lakes states, their senators and their representatives together and say, wait a minute, we hold 90% of the U.S. fresh water, 20% of the world's fresh water. Come on. California doesn't need 2. In fact, I think they may have gotten a 3rd one this year. So that's I'd like to see that happen.
And before we turn it to the audience for some questions, if people are able to stick around, we've heard some really great things that you have done and great things that the Watershed Council has done with respect to advocacy to protect our water resources. How can our members get involved more?
So, I am good. Let's get that. This is guy testifying. Not a fun thing to do with the face. All right. So a bunch of people got together down by Richmond in the Lake Southern end of Lake Michigan there, to preserve their walking beach, the ability to be able to walk their beach. And it resulted in the creation of a ordinance in that region that you cannot build revetments on the beach, that the beach has to be preserved for the public trust, and walking the beach is important. So they really took a bold step. And as Arlo Guthrie taught us in that famous Thanksgiving song, what is it?
Alice's Restaurant.
At Alice's Restaurant. That once you have a protest song, once you sing, then you have a movement. So they then, Chris Regan and his wife, wrote a protest song about revetments.
There's a big inland sea way up northern coast. Those unsalted waters all the way to the coast. On Marlin Lake, Michigan, over a strand. Great hulking dunes and miles of wet sand. It's a jewel that Big Lake wears with great pride. That ribbon of gold thrown down her east side. What a haven for sailors and sportsmen and more. Most come from mines just a day on shore. It's a magical place where the woods meet the lake. Both singing the white sand, she dance with her wind. Autumn that shows the breeze in your face. Feels like coming home to nature's embrace. There's a fortune if you own a piece of that beach. Carry it forever, that's hard to teach. They say homes are in danger, getting rocks round our door. Or worried their toilets won't flush anymore. It's a magical place where the woods meet the lake. Those singing white sand, she dance with the wind. Autumn that show with the breeze in your face. Feels like coming home to nature's embrace. That lake can be fierce when her mighty waves roll. They give and they take, no shores ebb and flow. To fight her is folly, make no mistake. And hardening this coast will be only hard. Those singing the white sand, she dance with the wind. Autumn that shore with the breeze in your face. Feels like coming home to nature's embrace. So if you love this beach and its shifting sands, speak up, raise your voice, come on, take a stand. If they build their walls and harden the shore, you'll find beaches and museums and you're walking around. It's a magic place where the woods meet the lake. Those singing the white sand, she dance with the wind. Audible, that shore with the breeze in your face. Feels like coming home to nature's embrace. Feels like coming home to nature's embrace.
Thank you, and with that, we can open up the floor for questions. Kevin?
Your video showed the possible breaking of the pipeline and everything drifting east. How often is it likely to drift east compared to likely to drift west?
Great question. So, like I said, that's one of 4,380 simulations. And I mean, we did that for that very reason, that it goes east more than west because we live in the area of the globe where western winds are prevalent. But it certainly does. One of the worst scenarios that if you were cared about the ecological fish populations, things like that, some of the worst ones that way were going into Lake Michigan rather than into Lake Huron. So I'd say that the ratio is probably 30 to 40% against the prevailing winds into Lake Michigan, and the other remainder into Lake Huron. But yeah, great question.
Yes.
Are you putting me?
You can go ahead.
Okay. I didn't know who you were pointing at. Is there a correlation between the risk of dragging an anchor, which I understand is perhaps the greatest risk with anchors when these freighters would drag their anchor, and the high waves? In other words, if you have 10 incidents a year at the high waves, someone might say, well, they might kind of brush that off. But if that correlates with, I don't know what conditions the freighters require when they throw out their anchor. Is it correlated with the waves?
Yeah, so, you know, that, the anchor drag thing was just stupid. He left Chicago with the anchor down and drove all the way through the straits and didn't notice that one anchor was down until they got to the mouth of the St. Mary's, where they always check their anchors and release the safety things in case they have to emergency anchor in the river for some reason. So, I mean, it just blows my mind that you could drive a vessel that far and not notice that something is a little wrong, especially when it's bouncing along the bottom like it was in the straits. So, I mean, so in terms of any rational correlation, I'm not sure that there is one with an irrational event like that. But certainly, in terms of marine accidents, there are far more accidents in rough weather than there is in calm weather. I mean, just everything that could possibly go wrong, from sediment in the fuel tank, and this is true for pleasure boats as well as big boats. That stuff starts going around, it brings things up into suspension, it shuts off engines, and you know, nothing good happens in big waves. So I think the weather is a major factor. I mean, just staying on course, and it's tight in the straits, it really is.
You talked about wave action, and what is that from wind, or how do you measure that? Because that was a major factor in determining erosion, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The waves come from the wind. So, and what makes us different than the ocean is our storms that come over the Great Lakes are about the same size as the Great Lakes themselves. So you see these low pressure and high pressure systems coming over. So almost all of our waves are what are called seas. They are being generated by the storm that is right here. A lot of the research on waves was done at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego. Their wave climate is dominated by what is called swell. And these are very regular waves. These are waves that are generated by a storm 4,000 miles away and have traveled across the Pacific. And it's a beautiful, calm day, and there's no wind, and these waves are, you know, they're great for surfing and all kinds of fun things like that. But our waves are very different because they're being generated right here with the storms. They're very steep, they're very tall, they can be every bit as big as the ocean waves. So they're very efficient at moving sand. And we mentioned drowning before. It was thought for a long time that because all the basic research on rip currents was done at Scripps, that you had to have these very long period waves, and they had to be very organized and smooth and clean like you see in the pictures in order to cause rip currents. So people believed that there were no rip currents except for the indigenous native folks who knew very well that there were rip currents here in the Great Lakes. In fact, there's paintings on rocks about the serpent that comes to the beach and drags people away. So it was a new thing for us to learn about. But our waves are very dangerous, and the long period swell is about 12 to 15 seconds between waves, where ours are 5 seconds between waves. So if you get knocked down by a wave and you're coughing and you stand up, and bam, you're getting knocked by another one. And keep in mind, a 3-foot chunk of water, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, weighs a ton. 2,000 pounds. So you're getting hit by a Volkswagen every 5 seconds. So, you know, we have very treacherous water here in the Great Lakes.
If I can remember back, my friends lost over 100 feet of beach off.
Yeah.
What was that, in the 50s?
Yeah.
40s?
Sleeping Bear lost.
Oh, yeah, just, the
100
house
acres.
almost fell into the lake, even they were 100 feet back from the bluff.
Yeah.
And people forget that.
Yeah.
What makes it, where's all this water come from that makes the lakes go up that much?
Yeah, so it's the wind over the water, but then the shape of the bottom, way out there where you can't even imagine, is just like a glass's lens. It will focus wave energy at a certain point and make it disperse over other points. So if there's a hump out there in the bottom, it will cause those waves to come and focus at a particular place along the shoreline. So the wave energy of the shoreline is extremely variable as you go down the shoreline because of the shape of the bottoms.
That makes sense, but where does all this water come from? The lakes go up a foot over that much area. I can't imagine how much water that is. It's massive.
10 times
Where's
more,
it come from?
10 times more water flows in the atmosphere, precipitation and snow,
Right.
than goes out the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Yeah.
So it's all from storm tracks and that's another half-hour conversation, but they change on decadal periods too. And
We have
you're
no
here in
control
El
over
Nino
that.
right now.
Yeah.
And I hate to do this because I know he's brilliant and you could learn a lot, but thank you, Guy. Hopefully maybe you can stick around a little bit for people that have some more
absolutely.
questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming today. We do invite you to walk across the street and take a look at the mural. Like I told you, we'd arranged some sun for you to take a look at it. Thank you for your patience. This is serious work that we do, and I appreciate that you all stayed here this morning and were part of getting that work done. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Sure.